Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this um, conference. I'm going to talk about building a global AI ethics through cultural collaboration. So, the title may sound a bit too optimistic at best and perhaps a bit naive at its worst. Building a global AI ethics through cultural collaboration, it even almost sounds like a contradiction. But yes, I think it is necessary and I think it is possible. And I will tell you why. I'll explain a bit about interconnectedness, about the notion of epistemic justice, and then make a suggestion about viewing culture as a calculus of AI ethics. And that should bring us to understanding of why the title makes sense. So, global regulation is necessary. That's the first point that we have to understand. We cannot get away from that. This is the kind of technology, AI technologies, threaten harm to individuals in such deep layers of their lives that ultimately the harm will be to humanity as a whole. So we need a global effort to work on responsibly governing this kind of technology. And sustainable AI development requires international cooperation. If you think in terms of ethics dumping and you think of companies, the transnational nature of most of the companies that are in control of this kind of technology, we cannot have a situation where there are still places in the world where they can do whatever they want. And then obviously, widening of inequality will impact negatively on everyone in the end. Africa is the continent with the lowest median age of about 19. And if we do not take this continent into account when we think about regulation and we think about the harm that's possible from this kind of technology in terms of social exclusion and many other kinds of harm, we are making a very big mistake. So one way to address this call that global regulation is necessary is then for me to go to interconnectedness. So this is a notion that comes not only from African philosophy, but actually also from Eastern philosophy, from Taoism, for instance. But I want to focus on the African version of it because I live on the African continent. So in African communities, a person is considered both collectively and individually. So there are two concepts that I want us to quickly consider. One is the concept of Ubuntu, which focus on the humanness of a person. A person is a person through other persons. I am because we are. And then the flip side almost of this kind of concept of Ubuntu is the concept of Ukama, which is about relatedness or communion. According to this notion, a person is only fully human in as far as they remain a part of the web of life. So what it in short comes down to is that harming one person means that one harms the whole web of life and one harms all humans. The collective ethics underpinning views such as this can be effective against potential harm from AI technologies that is ultimately imperiling all of humanity. Because again, it means that we need global regulation if we understand that harming one person means harming the whole. So it cannot just only be that one region is okay, but we don't care what happens in other regions. So, and actually, in fact, this notion is alive and well already in policymaking context. The Declaration on Ethical Principles for Climate Change, for instance, makes points to the principle of solidarity, which speaks of interdependency, which is not exactly the same as interconnectedness, but it at least has the beginning of the idea. And then the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI has this value of living in peaceful, just, and interconnected societies. So the second kind of piece of the tool in our toolkit that I want to talk about when we think about global regulation of AI ethics is the notion of epistemic justice. So epistemic justice is an epistemological value. And it comes in various forms, and I'll only explain one, which is testimonial justice. which speaks to hearing each other, hearing every person as a credible knower, as a credible contributor to knowledge in a specific context. But together with epistemic justice, we actually need a notion of equity. We need to understand that the conditions for hearing each other is different from situation to situation and might be different from social grouping to social grouping. So it is always best to consider issues of epistemic justice also together with considering concerns around equity. So what is necessary, why I talk about epistemic justice, is that if we think about global regulation and we think about starting from values and principles and working all the way through to actionalizing these principles into actions, well, we start with values. And so what is important is that every community, every social grouping has a chance to contribute to these values in some way so that they can be truly shared values if you think of global regulation. So the meaning of ascribed to value should be articulated and communicated in a context of openness to multiple epistemologies and diverse engagement. So we have to be sensitive for formulation. For instance, we need to consider rights-based and duty-based approaches to basic human rights standards and principles and how they would express the same value differently. But then, obviously, always, while being sensitive to formulation, while working in a context of epistemic justice and being open to alternative epistemologies, adherence to international law is always non-negotiable. And this then brings me to the notion of culture as calculus, so that we do not fall into this, so hearing everybody and everybody has to contribute, and then people start saying, okay, so anything goes. It's your values and it's my values, and we don't understand each other, and the values don't speak to each other, and that is absolutely not, in fact, the case if we think about AI ethics. And one way to illustrate this, or one way to make sure that this doesn't happen, is to view culture as a calculus, as a reasoning tool. So applying culture as a tool, as a calculus to build understanding of values and concerns and epistemic attitudes is crucial when we think about global regulation. We have to use different articulations of shared values to learn to understand different cultures, but also to highlight, and this is really important, aspects of ethical concerns that cannot otherwise be picked up on. So it is important that we don't always think along the same old lines, because then we do not really take into account what the different nuances are from within different cultures and within different regions. So we have to allow diversity in the values underpinning AI ethics to highlight different concerns. For instance, it is really important in the North to talk about privacy. It's also important in the Global South, but in the Global South, what is more important, or just as important, is ownership of data, because this is something that is a big issue on my side of the world, and it might not be such a big issue in the North, for obvious reasons. So we need to also then, while seeing culture as the lens through which we can interpret values and articulate and understand different articulations of values, we have to evaluate the correct nuance of approach. So sometimes it is necessary to have a rights-based approach, sometimes duty-based, sometimes value-based, to ensure the best uptake, to feel that people feel as if they will adhere to this kind of regulation because it seems familiar to them in some way. And we also have to vary the approach according to the context of regulation and explain why. So in this sense, if we implement culture as an interpretation tool, we can use it to measure inclusivity and to predict adherence. If we think about the way forward, we have to make clear the urgency of the possible negative impacts of AI by focusing on shared human concerns if we want to think about a global regulation. But at the same time, we should be applying the Ubuntu Karma value of interconnectedness as the canvas for a global AI ethics, understanding that harming one means harming the whole. And we should also remain focused on active participation of all cultures in AI regulation and of the interests of relevant cultures throughout the AI system lifecycle, because this is also very important, that it's not just in the design phase that values are important. It is actually, it's also in the development and the deployment and the use phases that values play a role. And then we should also situate culture then as the needle, not the scissors, to calculate and differentiate and distill values in manners that include every person in ways that are respectful and epistemically just. So this approach has the potential for positively influencing global openness to AI ethics regulation because it views humans in terms of an interwoven web of humanity and the environment, and the values driving it sound familiar, and every voice can be heard in the way needed. Thank you very much.